Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. For quite some time I've been a fan of some of the Grado headphones, and so I was excited recently when a pair of RS1Es came up secondhand on one of the forums. I grabbed them thinking they'd be my endpoint Grado that I'd be happy with forever, and also of course so I could do a review. Unfortunately what I found was that I still prefer my $100 Alessandro MS1s, which are also a Grado, they're like a spin-off brand. So instead of enjoying a $700 US pair of headphones, I keep going back to the $100 pair from basically the same company. If you want to find out why and what's gone wrong with the RS1s, stick around and I'll try to explain. I've already mentioned that the RS1E retails for about $700 US, so $695 US. That equates to a retail price of a little bit over 1,000 Australian dollars. So they're a fairly expensive headphone for something that's pretty basic, and as I'm about to explain to you, doesn't even sound as good as it should. Before I get into the drawbacks though, let me tell you a bit about the basics of it. It's a 32 ohm headphone with just shy of 100 decibels of sensitivity. So very easy to drive, it should perform pretty well from almost any source. The design of the headphone itself follows the typical Grado styling. So you've got the two ear cups on metal rods, and that swivels nicely, so you've got plenty of comfort adjustment there, as well as having a fair bit of tilt. In the case of the RS1s, they're a mahogany cup for the actual driver housing and an open face with the foam pads that sit the actual driver surface slightly off the ear, but they are still more of an on-ear design than an over-ear design. When you're spending a bit more money on something like the RS1s, you're getting a nice leather headband at the top, but the overall feel of the headphone is still very, very basic. The cable out the bottom is very thick, but again, it feels pretty old school, a bit cheap. The actual sheathing itself here is pretty rigid, and it just leads to me to feeling like I'm getting a cheap headphone with a high price tag. Now I can't emphasize enough, I really enjoy some of Grado's headphones, so I'm not anti-Grado overall. I like the simplicity of their designs, and ultimately if it sounds good, I don't particularly care about the aesthetics of it, within reason of course. But for me, the whole package of the RS1s, because they don't sound as good as I hoped they would, just all adds up to being a bit disappointing. While we're talking about the design, because the headband has very minimal padding under the leather, and also because of the on-ear design, they're not a particularly comfortable headphone. They're not uncomfortable as such, but they're not a headphone that I put on and notice that they are comfortable so much as a headphone that I put on and just get on with it. There are some headphones I put on and they're distinctly uncomfortable. These don't quite go that far, but they're not the most comfortable headphone I've worn, that's for sure. In terms of packaging and accessories, because I bought these secondhand, I don't have the original packaging they came in, but the accessories I do have. In terms of accessories, the RS1s are finished in a 3.5mm plug, so that's good for any sort of mobile use that you might want, but it is on quite a long cable and quite a heavy, thick cable. Of course, they come with a 6.3mm adapter, which is great. In addition to having the 6.3mm adapter there, there's also a short 6.3 to 3.5mm adapter cable, which I totally do not understand. It makes no sense to me at all. I'll come back to that in a second. And then you've also got a 6.3 to 6.3 extension. Now the weird thing for me in all of this is you've got a headphone here that's finished in the 3.5mm termination. So if you want to use this extension lead, you've got to take the 3.5mm plug, put a 6.3mm adapter on it, and then plug it into the extension lead. I just don't get why they did this. I don't understand why they didn't make this a 3.5 to 6.3mm adapter. Or, for that matter, finish the cable here in a 6.3mm and have a short 6.3 to 3.5mm adapter. Instead, what we've got, as I've already mentioned, is a 6.3 to 3.5mm. So unless the cables have been mixed up from a different model when I bought these secondhand, I just don't get this setup. Why on earth would you take a 3.5mm and then adapt it to a 6.3mm to plug into a 6.3mm extension cable to potentially then have to plug a 6.3mm back into a 6.3mm to turn it back into a 3.5mm. Confused yet? It's a really weird setup. For me, this cable should have been a simple 3.5 to 6.3, or they should have terminated that in a 6.3 and then use this for mobile usage. All in all, it just makes no sense to me. I can't wrap my head around what exactly they were thinking was going to be the use case that makes any of this make sense. The moment you're using a plug-in adapter before you can use an extension lead is just crazy. All those connections are A, less secure, and B, are likely to degrade the sound quality. Even if it's ever so slightly, it's just not ideal. Not to mention if you lose the 6.3mm adapter, these suddenly become useless until you buy another one. So everything about the RS1s just doesn't quite add up for me. And I'll talk about the sound in a second because that's really the nail in the coffin. But before I go into that, what I wanted to mention was that with something like the Grados, where they are such a basic design, and it's really the same design across the range, unless you're getting up into the metal housings where there's quite a lot of work and machining going into that. And not to mention that there is machining and working going into these wooden cups. They're a very nice design. They look great, they feel great. So I'm not for a second knocking the craftsmanship that's gone in to making these. They're absolutely beautiful in that regard, but they're very, very basic and simple. And so what you're essentially paying for with these designs is, in theory, the driver tuning and the driver matching. Grado make a point of stressing how carefully they match the drivers, and that is really important. That makes a big difference to things like stereo imaging and the accuracy of the soundstage. But ultimately you're paying $700 here for a headphone that, after relatively basic manufacturing of the housing for those headphones, those drivers themselves, what you're getting ultimately is, or should be, I shouldn't say is, but should be, a very well-tuned and well-matched pair of drivers. Now the matching appears to be fine, the tuning is a whole nother question. In terms of sound, something I noticed about the RS1s was that they do tend to sound a bit better loud, but there's issues turning it up loud because they've got a level of treble emphasis that just means that loud they tend to get a bit sharp and a bit bright, and they don't have enough bass to offset that. If we break down the sound signature specifically, they've got a significant roll off in the bass and a slight mid-bass lift, but not enough in my opinion. And the reason I say that is because there's a 2 kHz treble spike from the RS1s that, or maybe not a spike, it's a lift. So it's more of a flatter section of increased treble around 2 kHz. And what that does is, for me at least, throws the entire tonal balance off. Everything leans towards the treble, things don't sound as natural as they should, and it's masking a lot of other details in the rest of the spectrum. So what I mean by masking is there's a phenomenon with our hearing that if you have certain sounds that are significantly louder than other sounds, our ears are unable to pick up the quieter sounds. So what's happening in the case of the RS1e is that the 2 kHz lift is causing the details within the mid-range, the rest of the treble, and indeed the bass to be either perceived at a lower volume or not heard at all. Now that may sound really extreme to think that you're not going to hear certain sounds. It's not like you just can't tell that there's bass and mids there, but you lose the detail, and in losing the detail, you lose some of the spatial information, the textural information, and just the organic qualities of the music. What you can hear is refined, it's well delivered, the soundstage is quite nice in terms of its level of focus, but it's not particularly large, and the bass is definitely clean and fast. So from that point of view, there's a lot to like about the RS1e's sound if it weren't for the fact that the overall tonal balance to me is just off kilter. The one place I find the RS1es do work quite well is for classical and acoustic sounds. Because you're not relying on any warmth from the bass in a lot of that music, and instead most of it's focused in the range where the RS1es are performing quite well, it does actually work for those genres. The moment you start getting into electronic music, jazz, pop and rock, and things that have got bass guitars and kick drums, it just doesn't quite work for me. I find them unenjoyable, unengaging. They're fine, they're not bad to listen to, but for $700 I definitely expect more than what I get out of the RS1e. In fact, having listened to them a little bit, I went back and tried my good old Alessandro MS1s. Now these have been knocked around, they're really old. One of the earpieces, I think it's this one, yep, falls off really easily. So they've been in the wars. Obviously that can just be glued back on. I just haven't gotten around to doing that. But the point being, I'm enjoying a $100 headphone better than a $700 headphone. So whilst there's no doubt the RS1e is more refined and does some things better than the MS1s, the overall picture, the overall enjoyment for me is much, much better on the MS1s. They've got a better tonal signature, they've got better energy and excitement in the music, and it's easy to put up with their flaws being some slightly grainy and sharp treble. They've got just a bit of a looser sound overall that's not as well refined, but they're enjoyable, they're fun. I put them on, and even though they're cheap, I am happy to leave them on for ages. To put this in perspective a little bit, I ran both sets of headphones through the test on my mini DSP ears here. Now I want to stress that whenever I'm sharing measurements on the channel, it's really important to know that you shouldn't compare them with other people's measurements. That's not a cop-out for me because I've done a bad job of measuring or I don't trust my measurements. Where I'm coming from with that is that my particular setup in terms of the room I'm measuring it in and any background noise, combined with the way I'm choosing to smooth the curves, the scale that I'm working on, all of the fine details in terms of how I've set it up, means that my graphs should only be compared with my graphs. So I'll use them here on the channel to demonstrate differences and similarities between headphones, but please note that they may not look exactly the same as other people's graphs due to changes in scale, smoothing, and the like. This is probably a good time to mention that if you want access to all the measurements that I take, patrons have full access to all of the graphs for all of the measurements. So if you're interested in that, take a look at the link down below, jump over to Patreon and have a look at the tiers where measurements are available, and even custom comparisons are available to the top level tier. For now though, let's come back and look at the graphs of these two headphones. Straight away when looking at this, you can see there's a few key differences, but there's also a lot of similarities between these two headphones. Firstly, if we start at the left-hand side of the graph, what you'll notice is that the MS1s don't roll off as fast as the RS1s. And even though the RS1s have that mid-bass boost, what I find is that the MS1 comes across as the warmer and bassier sounding headphone. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the extra extension in the bass keeps the bass presence there for longer as the bass gets lower. Having the bass better reproduced down around say 60 Hertz gives the fullness to the sound that the RS1s, to me at least, are lacking. On top of that, you'll notice that there's a significant increase in around the 2 kHz mark, that 2 to 3 kHz range, for the RS1s compared to the MS1s. That's the issue for me, is there's too much 2 kHz to 3 kHz energy, and it offsets the entire balance of the sound. So what it means is if you're turning up the RS1s to try to get enough bass warmth to feel like you really engage with the music and you're feeling the rhythm of it, by that time, you're getting too much of that treble in your face and it becomes unenjoyable. The MS1s, on the other hand, do have a little bit more treble in the 4 to 5 kHz range, but it just makes them a little bit sharp and aggressive sounding, but done in a relatively good way. They rarely get too aggressive and sibilant, it just brings energy to the music. I should add that my measurement device does have an artifact at around that 4 to 5 kHz mark that increases the measurements for all headphones there. So what's important when looking at these graphs is not the absolute amplitude at that 4 to 5 kHz range, so much as the difference between the two headphones. So realistically, the bump on the RS1s is actually a 2 to 3 kHz bump, whereas the bump on the MS1s is more focused around the 4 to 5 kHz mark. They do still have some 2 kHz lift, but it's not out of balance with the rest of the signature in the way it is on the RS1s. So even though you're sacrificing some refinement and some driver control with the MS1s, and things can get a little bit average at times, a little bit sharp, a little bit aggressive, but never painful, I'd say. So it's more just that you can hear you listening to a cheaper headphone. Even though that's the case, the overall tonal balance of the MS1s is so much more enjoyable to me than the RS1s. And that's just not right when you're spending $700 versus $100. I'd be fine if the RS1s were a headphone that was not to my personal taste, but had qualities about it that I can appreciate and enjoy. For example, the HD800S is a fantastic headphone that's not to my personal tastes, but I don't say negative things about it because it is an impressive headphone at what it does. The RS1, on the other hand, doesn't fit that bill. It's not impressive at what it does, and to me, it's just not a particularly enjoyable headphone. It's not bad, it's not dreadful, but it's just not enjoyable, and at $700, I think it should be. To put this into a final piece of perspective before I wrap it up, I was thinking about what other headphones I would compare with the RS1e for this review. And as I thought about it, I didn't really have anything in my collection that's at about the same price point. I've got things like the Focal Clear that are significantly more, but I didn't have anything in the same price point that's still available on the market. So I started thinking about other headphones, and I haven't done comparisons because ultimately the headphones that I would choose over the RS1s are so much cheaper. I recently reviewed the HiFiMan Sundara, and I've currently got here for review the Monolith M1060, the second version of those. I would choose both of those in a heartbeat over the RS1s, and both of them cost about half as much. So as you're probably gathering, I'm not going to recommend these really to anybody. Maybe if you're really into classical or acoustic and you want to give these a try, it might be worth a go. But I think if you were in that boat, I'd probably still say try the Sundaras, try the 1060s from Monoprice, try the MS1s for that matter. There's lots of other headphones out there I would go to first before the RS1s. So if anyone from Grado is watching, I'm really sorry that this is a negative review. I don't like to put out negative reviews if I can avoid it, and I try to find both the pros and the cons of a headphone and kind of see who it will suit and who I might recommend it for, even if it's not perfect for everybody. But I just find the RS1 to be such a flawed headphone for the price at which it sits that I don't think I can really recommend it to anybody. If this review has been helpful to you, maybe saved you $700, please think about hitting the subscribe button and hitting the like button. But other than that, I'll leave you to the music. Happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.